You turn on the TV late at night. The glow of the screen fills the room, and that quiet electronic hum feels almost alive. A flicker of static, the low hiss of white noise, and then sudden movement. A scream, blood on the wall. Your pulse jumps. It's not real, of course. You're safe in your living room, but for that split second, your body doesn't know the difference. That's the strange power of horror in video games. You're not just watching it happen, you're inside of it. Video games are the only art form that let you stand directly in the path of danger and then decide what to do about it. You control the flashlight, you open the door, you hear something move in the dark and still take one step closer because you have to know what's there. That sense of agency, the ability to act with inside of fear. That's what makes this medium so endlessly fascinating. Welcome to Arcane Station. I'm your host, Mike Porter, and tonight we're going to explore how horror evolved inside games, how it borrowed from folklore, film, and psychology, and how it keeps reinventing itself. We'll move through the early years of ASCII symbols to the pixelated terror and into the current generation of realism that makes gaming feel more like a movie. We'll visit the cryptid and paranormal worlds that shape modern titles, talk a little bit about my own time developing games, including Nocturne and 2 of the Blair Witch series, and then look ahead into indie studios that are redefining what horror can be. If you strip horror down to its bones, the fear of the unknown is what really grabs our imagination. In the early days of gaming, technology was limited, so everything depended on what the players pictured in their own minds. Back in 1982, Haunted House on the Atari 2600 gave you nothing but 2 glowing eyes drifting through a dark mansion. No gore, no detailed monsters, just the suggestion of danger, and it worked. Around the same time, 3D Monster Maze on the Sinclair ZX81 placed players in a simple labyrinth stalked by a single blocky T-Rex made up of ASCII symbols. These symbols made up many of the earlier games where your brain had to fill in the gaps and visualize the enemies. The graphics were crude, but the anxiety was real. People tensed up the same way they do in a theater seat. By the late 80s, horror started to gain some structure. Japan's Sweet Home blended role-playing elements with haunted house storytelling and became the direct ancestor of the Resident Evil series. In the West, Alone in the Dark brought Lovecraftian dread to early 3D design. You moved a fragile human character through fixed camera angles and puzzle-filled rooms, never knowing what shape would emerge from the shadows. These were slow, methodical, deliberate experiences built on atmosphere and restraint, and they laid the foundation for what we now call survival horror. And this restraint was important because there wasn't a whole lot of processing power to actually work with. When Resident Evil arrived in 1996, the formula clicked. Limited ammunition, locked doors, claustrophobic hallways. Every design choice pressed you into a corner. It wasn't just about killing zombies, it was trying to have you stay calm even when everything conspired to trap you. 3 years later, Silent Hill took an inward turn, looking into horror as something psychological. The foggy streets of that ghost town version of America, which mimicked Centralia, Pennsylvania, mirrored the mind of its protagonist, making fear personal. By the turn of the century, horror in games had learned something important. The scariest thing you can show a player is uncertainty, the fear of the unknown. Once we realized that fear of the unknown was our deepest form of fear, developers began to look outward, to folklore, to cryptids, to the myths that already haunted our culture. Stories of creatures lurking in the forests or mountains translated perfectly into interactive media because games could recreate that sense of isolation. You're in the woods at night. You hear something moving beyond the tree line. Do you run, or do you stay and look? In recent years, a game called Bigfoot by Cyberlight Studio captured that feeling better than almost any film. A handful of players set out with trail cameras and tranquilizer rifles to track a creature that may or may not exist. Most of the time, nothing happens. You just wait, listening. That tension and not knowing when something might happen is a great way to build up the player's response once it actually does happen. Then there's the Skinwalker Hunt. It's a solitary experience set in the desert and forests of the Southwest. It draws from Navajo legend, respecting the ambiguity of the unknown and keeping you in a tense state. You don't know if the thing you're following, or if it's following you, is an animal, a human, or something else entirely. Another excellent game in this genre is a Gracewind tale, Do You Copy? It's set in a single location with well-formed environmental detail, excellent storytelling, and both environmental and narrative, and sound design that really sets your fight or flight responses into overdrive. Cryptid horror works because it blurs the line between the natural and supernatural. These games are the same thrill that drives real-world investigators who camp in the woods at night with night vision cameras. Cryptids are just an extension of the unknown, and horroring tales of encounters make these types of games appeal to those wanting both fast-paced action and suspense. The natural extension of fear into the realm of the unseen takes us into paranormal gaming, which explores what happens when technology itself becomes haunted. It's the notion that the machines we build could hold avatars or embodiment spirits, perhaps, of us. Or it might open windows we don't understand. Few titles capture this tension as well as phantasmophobia. It's a cooperative ghost hunting game where you and friends enter an abandoned house armed with EMF meters, spirit boxes, and thermal cameras. The ghosts respond to your microphone, whisper your name, and can slam doors when provoked. It's procedural and unpredictable. The tools mimic real-world investigative gear, making every reading feel plausible. Long before Phantasmophobia, Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly offered a similar intimacy. Instead of a gun, the player carried a camera. To defend yourself, you had to look directly at the spirit that was rushing you and press the shutter at the last possible second. It was simple but deeply psychological. You couldn't run from the ghost, you had to face it, head on. That design choice turned photography, a familiar everyday act, into something terrifying. You start to wonder what else your camera might be capturing when you're not looking. And one of the most successful use of ghosts in games is in Fear. The story revolves around a fictional unit called First Encounter Assault Recon Unit, or Fear, an elite group tasked with investigating supernatural phenomena. When a mysterious paramilitary force infiltrates an aerospace compound, the elite Fear team is assembled to deal with the extraordinary circumstances. The player, oddly enough named Point Man, must navigate countless firefights while witnessing paranormal manifestations conjured by a mysterious little girl in red. Paranormal horror gives us a glimpse into a world where ghosts can manifest and interact with us physically. So the question there is, how do you fight something that is spiritual in form? And that was what brought the tension to that game. And before we move on from the haunted and the unseen, there's one game series that deserves special attention. Around 2010, when most big studios had turned horror into sort of an action game with shotguns, explosions, and very little chance of dying because of the amount of health packs you could find. A small Swedish studio called Frictional Games quietly reminded everyone what fear could actually feel like. They released Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and the entire genre changed overnight. At first glance, Amnesia didn't seem revolutionary. There's no weapons, no combat, no boss fights. Just a first-person view of a man waking up in a decaying castle with no memory. But within minutes, players realized they were trapped, not just in a place, but in a state of mind. The darkness itself became an enemy. Stay too long in the dark, and your sanity began to slip. The lantern offered light, but also gave your position away. Every decision, whether to move, hide, or even look, became a gamble between safety and the awareness of the creatures trying to attack you. That design philosophy turned Amnesia into something new. So we talk about survival horror, but this felt like a vulnerability horror. You weren't a soldier, you were prey. The monsters were terrifying, but what made them effective is how rarely you actually saw them. Or you'd hear their breathing and footsteps and their whispers. But your imagination did most of the work. The real monster wasn't inside of you, it was your mind unraveling as these events took place. The impact was immediate. Horror fans and developers realized that minimalism could be terrifying again. Amnesia revived the kind of dread that earlier classics like Silent Hill had cultivated, but in a fully immersive first-person space. Because it was an indie game built on a modest budget, it inspired a wave of creators, proving that stripping away comfort and forcing the player into darkness could be profoundly effective. The most recent entry, The Bunker, added agency and unpredictability. An AI-driven creature that hunts you dynamically while you scavenge for supplies. Even after more than a decade, Frictional still understands the secret. Horror works best when it feels like it's responding to you, and fleeting glimpses of a creature is far more terrifying than a full-on fight. By the time Amnesia reminded everyone that horror could still be a personal and terrifying experience, the rest of the industry was chasing something a bit different: realism. Games had begun crossing an invisible line, moving away from abstract dread towards experiences that felt grounded, cinematic, and emotional. The goal wasn't just to scare players anymore, it was to make them believe. In the early 2010s, hardware had finally caught up with that ambition. Motion capture and facial performances could now capture tiny expressions of fear, guilt, hesitation, and suddenly the characters didn't feel like avatars, they felt alive. With that shift came a new kind of horror, one not built on just shadows and monsters, but on empathy and the human experiences. You can see this most clearly in The Last of Us. On the surface, it's a post-pandemic story filled with infected creatures, but the real terror wasn't the creatures, it was what it turned people into. Monsters of a type, lacking empathy, the desire to kill for scraps. The tension comes from every human encounter, every moral compromise. The fear isn't that you'll die, it's that you'll become someone you don't recognize. When you watch Joel and Ellie interact, every small gesture matters. That quiet realism gets under your skin. The Last of Us redefined the emotional range of horror games. It made heartbreak part of the fear, loss part of the fear. Around the same time, games like Until Dawn took cinematic realism in a different direction, blending branching narrative with filmic responses and performances. It played like an interactive slasher movie, where every decision had consequences and actors gave the story emotional grounding. That small shift in agency made familiar tropes feel fresh again. Realism also reshaped long-running franchises. Resident Evil had spent years drifting towards action until Capcom brought it back with the Resident Evil 2 remake. That game didn't just update the visuals, it updated its presence. Leon's flashlight beam, the slickness of the blood on the floor, the weight of every footstep. All of it made Raccoon City feel like a real place in a way that it had never felt before. This pursuit of realism also extended beyond visuals. Sound design became more meticulous. Developers started mixing binaural audio to simulate space and direction. The creak of a stair, the wind, the way it moves through a hallway, even the wet sound of breathing in the dark. It all combined to create an illusion of physical proximity. Horror games became less about what you saw and more about what you felt pressing in around you. There was also an emotional realism at play. Games like Outlast and Visage focused on psychological decay. They made you question perception itself. What's real, what's hallucination, and what trauma leaves behind. That kind of realism relies on honesty. It's the same reason that Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice worked so powerfully. It treats psychosis not as a gimmick, but as a lived experience. And they did so by collaborating with neuroscientists to make sure that they were treating this thing in an honest and thoughtful way. Horror grounded in truth can be scarier than any ghost story, especially when you feel that your mind is slipping and the horror is seeping in. Realism also brought credibility. It made horror believable again. Players stopped saying that's fake, and they started saying that could happen. And once a story crosses that line, it doesn't need to scream or holler or even have jump scares to feel frightening. It just needs to be patient and methodical and slow-paced until it erupts into violence. This focus on systems of control and hidden power led to the rise of conspiracy-based narratives. As horror matured, it started asking bigger questions. What if the real threat wasn't supernatural at all? What if fear came from the systems of control, secret agencies, government cabals, experiments, and hidden powers operating behind the scenes? Conspiracy-based horror gives us a different kind of monster, bureaucracy and secrecy. When Deus Ex launched in 2000, it blended cyberpunk aesthetics with classic conspiracy lore. Players uncovered links between shadow governments, the Illuminati, and artificial intelligence. What made it unsettling wasn't the violence but the plausibility. The player was forced to doubt official explanations, and paranoia itself became a kind of gameplay mechanic. The game arrived before widespread social media and mass surveillance, yet it predicted both. Nearly 20 years later, Control refined that idea into art. Its world centers on a government agency studying objects that warp reality. You explore a building that rearranges itself when you're not looking. An endless labyrinth of files and whispered reports. It's both mundane and impossible, which is exactly what makes it feel true. Conspiracy horror resonates because it mirrors everyday anxiety. We all sense that someone, somewhere, understands more than we do. Games like these turn that unease into a place we can walk through and survive. By the end of the 90s, horror in games had grown bold enough that studios began experimenting with cinematic storytelling. I worked with Terminal Reality and Gathering of Developers, better known as God Games, and I worked on Nocturne and later 2 of the Blair Witch game series. Nocturne was set in the late 1920s to early 1930s during the Prohibition era, and it was mixed with pulp magazine adventure and horror. Players took on the role of an operative from a secret organization called Spook House. This organization was created by President Theodore Roosevelt to combat monsters threatening humanity. It was an ambitious game for its time, using one of the first engines to handle real-time lighting, volumetric fog, and cloth simulation. The technology let us do something unusual, build tension through the light and shadow instead of shock. And there were shocks in there, don't get me wrong, but that sense of unease when you're searching through a building using volumetric light and then seeing something jump into view, pretty terrifying. When the Blair Witch Project exploded into theaters, our team was asked to expand that universe into interactive form. I worked on 2 volumes, as I said, but there were 3 produced, each exploring a different moment in the mythos, blending folklore, cryptid legends, and real historical material into one uneasy narrative. We didn't have massive budgets or armies of developers. What we had was creativity and a belief that fear comes from what you suggest, not what you show. But we did show some stuff, just that we built tension prior to doing so. That idea guided every decision. Dim lanterns instead of spotlights, muffled footsteps instead of jump scares. Looking back, I see how those games acted as a bridge between the experimental horror of the past and the narrative-driven styles that dominate today. The lesson I carried forward was simple. Atmosphere and pacing matter far more than visual polish. And not all horror crawls out of the ground. Some of it comes from above. from the realization that humanity might be small, fragile, and not alone. Extraterrestrial horror has long been a part of science fiction, but in video games it became something intimate. Space wasn't just a backdrop, it was a trap. Dead Space in 2008 redefined that isolation. You're an engineer, not a soldier, repairing a silent mining ship whose crew has been transformed by an alien artifact. The corridors are narrow, the lights flicker, and every tool you hold doubles as a weapon. The game's sound design, hollow clanks, distant groans, and sudden silence keeps your nerves taut. What makes it powerful isn't the monsters, but the loneliness. You're adrift, in a vacuum, fighting not just creatures, but the creeping sense that you might be losing your mind. Then there's Alien Isolation, released in 2014, which dared to slow down horror once again. The xenomorph cannot be killed. You can only hide, breathe quietly, and hope it passes. Every time you think you're safe, it learns, adapting to your tactics. The fear becomes almost respectful. You're dealing with a perfect organism, and your survival feels like a temporary negotiation. Both of these games tap into the cosmic horror's oldest theme, that the universe is infinite and it doesn't care whether we live or die, transforming that idea into something playable. And there's no way to talk about horror games without mentioning zombies. They've become one of the most enduring, flexible creatures in interactive storytelling. What makes them fascinating isn't just that they're frightening, it's that they keep changing with us. Every era reinvents them to fit their own fears. The earliest versions in games were simple. Resident Evil made them iconic, shambling corpses in mansion corridors, slow but relentless. You could outmaneuver them, but you never outrun what they represented, a contamination and loss of control. But by the mid-2000s, the zombie wasn't just a monster anymore, it was a mirror. Developers began using the undead to explore survival, mortality, and what it means to remain human when everything else familiar collapses. Take Dead Island or Dead Island 2. On the surface, it's a resort overrun by infection. The game leans into physicality, swinging makeshift weapons, scavenging, and hearing the crack of bone. It's less about escape and more about endurance, realizing that vacation has turned into the apocalypse. Then came The Last of Us, which changed the conversation entirely. Its infected aren't supernatural. They're the victims of a fungal mutation. That bit of scientific plausibility made the horror feel intimate. But the real story wasn't about infection at all. It was about connection. Joel and Ellie's journey across a ruined America reframed the zombie narrative from survival horror into emotional survival. Games like Left 4 Dead and Dying Light added cooperation. In Left 4 Dead, players had to depend on each other completely, sharing medkits and covering each other's flanks while they reloaded. The undead weren't terrifying because they were clever. They were terrifying because they were endless, and they came in hordes, turning teamwork into tension. Dying Light took that urgency and remixed it with parkour, forcing players to use agility instead of brute strength. When night fell in that game, the city belonged to the infected, and even veteran players felt their stomach drop. Zombies in games have always reflected our real-world anxieties. In the early days, they spoke to Cold War paranoia. In the 2000s, they echoed fears of pandemics and societal collapse. More recently, they've become metaphors for apathy and losing individuality. They endure because they let us explore impossible scenarios without danger, without collapse. Every player who gathers supplies or builds barricades is playing out a fantasy of resilience. In games where you control every step, the loss the zombie represents hits harder than any movie ever could. After the blockbuster years of the early 2000s, horror began to fragment again. Big studios chased action and spectacle, while smaller teams turned to atmosphere and story. What emerged was an indie renaissance, proof that you don't need millions of dollars to unsettle someone. Take Signalis. It's a lo-fi science fiction nightmare that blends pixel art with existential dread. Every room feels like a forgotten memory, every encounter heavy with meaning. It pays homage to classics like Silent Hill while carving out a space of its own, showing how minimalism can be more haunting than realism. Then there's Iron Lung, a one-person project that traps you inside a tiny submarine exploring an ocean of blood. You never see the outside world, you only see glimpses of it through a grainy camera feed. The fear comes from claustrophobia and implication. And then games such as Madison and Visage pick up where PT left off, using photorealism and dynamic sound to make an ordinary house feel cursed. Others like World of Horror go in the opposite direction, using black and white comic style visuals inspired by Junji Ito to create an atmosphere of slow, creeping decay. What unites all of these is experimentation. Indie developers aren't bound by market expectations, board meetings, or even stock negotiations, so they play with perspective, pacing, and narrative structure. They prove that horror doesn't depend on graphics, it depends on imagination and empathy. They use horror not to just scare, but to communicate something deeply human. In that way, the indie scene has become the most conscious of the genre, pushing it forward while keeping it honest. So why do we keep going back to horror? Why do we pay to be frightened when there's already enough anxiety in the world? Maybe it's because games offer a different kind of controlled chaos. They let us explore danger from a safe distance, to test our reactions and to find meaning inside the dark. Every successful horror game gives us a small rehearsal for real life, the reminder that fear can be managed, even mastered. There's also a curiosity at work. Horror games invite us to peel back the curtain and see what hides behind the everyday. They make us listen to the creak of a door, the rhythm of our own heartbeat, the sound of static that could mean nothing or everything. They slow us down and force us to notice details. And of course, there's the community. Players share stories, trade theories, post clips of impossible events. Horror thrives on conversation. Every "did you see that?" or "I swear something moved behind me" keeps the myth alive. In that sense, games have become the new campfire, the place where we gather to tell scary stories, only now the stories are digital, interactive, and endlessly evolving. The future of horror in games is wide open. Virtual reality technology is gaining popularity. It still has a ways to go, but it's starting to deliver the kind of immersion that early developers could only dream of. Artificial intelligence promises enemies that learn from your behavior, environments that respond to emotion, even narratives that shift according to heart rate. Those tools could make horror more personal than ever. They'll also raise the questions about comfort and consent. How real is too real? And as an example, one of the doctoral students at the university I was at, he was working on an AI model that had emotional trauma built in, and they would react realistically based on previous traumas and how you interacted with that AI. And it was in its infancy, but it was already using the big five of emotional archetypes and was able to build relationships between trauma and experiences in interactive narrative. So it's getting there. What matters most, though, is that the spirit of experimentation remains. The next great horror experience might come from a solo developer in their apartment, just like Iron Lung. It might mix genres, science fiction, folklore, true crime, or blur the boundary between game and documentary. And I have seen some games that do that. They take real-world events that are horrific, like mass murderers or one-off events, and turn those into video games. Whatever shape it takes, it will continue to the same tradition that it began, with a pair of glowing eyes on a black screen, using your imagination to turn a story into fear. From 8-bit ghosts to cinematic nightmares, horror in video games has evolved alongside us. Each generation adds new layers, better visuals, deeper writing, but the heart of it stays the same. It's the quiet moment before that next door opens, when you take a breath and decide to move forward anyway. Horror in games isn't just about survival, it's about curiosity, courage, and the strange beauty of confronting the unknown on your own terms. So whether you're exploring a haunted house, creeping through an abandoned spaceship, or waiting in the woods with a camera pointed at the trees, remember that the feeling tying all of this together is wonder. Fear and wonder are two sides of the same coin, and video games let us flip it again and again. Thank you for joining me on this dive into the history and future of interactive horror. If a particular game ever kept you awake at night, or if you've got a story from your own time wandering digital darkness, I'd love to hear it. You can find the discussion on the Arcane Station Discord or at arcanestation.com. I'll be posting a link to the Discord on the website, arcane-station.com. Stay curious, stay cautious, and keep that controller charged, because you never know what might be waiting when the screen goes dark. If you're enjoying these episodes, please tell a friend, rate and review. And if you would like to support the show, please consider joining our Patreon. That's patreon.com/CW/Arcane Station Podcast, all together, no spaces. Arcane Station Podcast on Patreon. I look forward to hearing from you. If you have any suggestions for the show, also please send them to mike@arcane-station.com. Thank you. Have a good night.